I used to believe that family meant safety, that the people who called you mom would never dream of putting you in harm's way. But at 72 years old, I've learned that sometimes the most dangerous predators are the ones who smile sweetest while they sharpen their claws. That realization hit me like a sledgehammer to the chest the night my daughter-in-law Cassandra locked me in my own basement during her elaborate dinner party, thinking she could silence me forever, until the police arrived with a warrant that would shatter her perfect little world. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Evelyn Hartwell, and I've spent 4 decades as a retired federal auditor in the quiet town of Willowbrook Heights. I've seen enough financial fraud and corporate scheming to recognize manipulation when it walks through my front door, wearing designer heels and carrying expensive wine. What I didn't expect was for that manipulation to come wrapped in family ties, delivered by a woman who called me mom, while systematically destroying everything I'd worked my entire life to build. The house I live in, or rather lived in, sits on 3 acres of prime real estate in one of Willowbrook Heights' most coveted neighborhoods. My late husband Theodore and I bought it 37 years ago, when it was just a modest 2-story colonial. Over the decades, we transformed it into something magnificent. Expanded the kitchen, added a master suite, converted the basement into a beautiful guest apartment complete with its own entrance, full bathroom, and kitchenette. Theodore always joked that we were building our retirement castle, brick by brick, paycheck by paycheck. When Theodore passed from cancer 3 years ago, the house felt impossibly large and hollow. The silence echoed off walls that once rang with laughter, dinner conversations, and the comfortable sounds of a life well lived together. That's when my son Benjamin suggested that he and Cassandra move in temporarily. They were struggling financially. Benjamin's architecture firm had taken a hit during the economic downturn, and Cassandra's boutique consulting business was, in her words, experiencing a transitional phase. I should have seen the red flags immediately. Cassandra had a way of speaking that made everything sound reasonable, even generous. "Evelyn, this arrangement will be perfect for everyone," she'd said, settling into my favorite armchair like she already owned it. "Benjamin can help with the yard work and home maintenance. I can assist with your medications and doctor appointments, and we'll all save money. Plus, little Emma will finally have a yard to play in instead of that cramped apartment." At the time, it seemed like a blessing. Emma was my only grandchild, a sweet 7-year-old with Theodore's mischievous eyes and my stubborn streak. The thought of watching her grow up in the house where her father had once built tree forts and learned to ride a bicycle felt like a gift from heaven. I imagined teaching her to garden in the rose beds Theodore had planted, reading bedtime stories in the library we'd carefully curated over decades, maybe even teaching her to bake Theodore's famous apple cinnamon cookies. What I got instead was a masterclass in psychological warfare. Cassandra moved in like she was staging a hostile takeover. Within the first week, she'd rearranged my kitchen for better efficiency, relocated my medication organizer to a cabinet I could barely reach, and somehow convinced Benjamin that my evening television time was too loud for Emma's bedtime routine. Never mind that I'd been watching the evening news at the same volume for 20 years, or that Emma's bedroom was on the opposite side of the house with the door closed. "We're just trying to create a harmonious living environment," Cassandra would say with that practiced smile, the one that never quite reached her calculating green eyes. "Change can be difficult, but it's necessary for growth." The changes came in waves, each one small enough to seem petty if I complained, but collectively devastating to my sense of home and autonomy. Benjamin, my sweet conflict-avoiding son, became a ghost in his own childhood home. Whenever I tried to discuss my concerns with him, he'd get that deer-in-headlights expression and mutter something about not wanting to cause problems. "Mom, Cassandra's just trying to help," he'd say, avoiding my eyes. "She has experience with organization and efficiency. Maybe some changes aren't such a bad thing?" But the most insidious change was how Cassandra began controlling information about me. She intercepted my mail, claiming she was helping organize my correspondence. She answered my phone calls, telling friends and neighbors that I was resting or not feeling well today. She even convinced my doctor's office to add her as an emergency contact, explaining that I was experiencing memory issues and needed family assistance with medical decisions. The truth was, my mind was as sharp as ever. Sharper, actually, because I was beginning to piece together exactly what Cassandra was doing. She wasn't just living in my house. She was systematically isolating me, controlling my environment, and positioning herself as my caretaker. Every helpful suggestion was actually another chain around my independence, another step toward making me completely dependent on her goodwill. The basement incident wasn't random violence or a moment of lost temper. It was the culmination of months of careful planning, the final move in a chess game I'd only recently realized I was playing. What Cassandra didn't know, what she couldn't have known, was that 40 years as a federal auditor had taught me to document everything, to notice patterns, and to always keep evidence. She thought she was dealing with a lonely old widow who would be grateful for any scraps of family attention. What she actually had on her hands was a woman who'd spent decades investigating people far more sophisticated than a small-town social climber with delusions of grandeur. The night she locked me in that basement, confident that her dinner party would provide the perfect cover for her next phase of manipulation, she made her fatal mistake. She underestimated exactly who she was dealing with. And when those police officers arrived at my front door with that warrant in hand, Cassandra's carefully constructed world began to crumble like a house of cards in a hurricane. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Let me tell you exactly who I am, because understanding my background is crucial to appreciating just how catastrophically Cassandra miscalculated her target. I am Evelyn Rose Hartwell, 72 years old, and for 43 years I served as a senior federal auditor for the Internal Revenue Service's Criminal Investigation Division. Most people hear tax auditor and imagine some meek bureaucrat shuffling papers behind a desk. What they don't realize is that criminal tax investigators are essentially financial detectives, trained to uncover elaborate schemes, follow money trails through labyrinthine corporate structures, and recognize patterns of fraud that would make your head spin. During my career, I helped bring down 3 major organized crime families, exposed a multi-million-dollar church embezzlement ring, and personally investigated over 200 cases of identity theft, money laundering, and tax evasion. I've sat across interrogation tables from some of the most cunning con artists in the country, people who could smile at you while picking your pocket and make you thank them for the privilege. I've seen every manipulation tactic in the book, and I've developed an almost supernatural ability to spot deception. More importantly, I never, ever investigated a case without building an airtight paper trail. Documentation wasn't just part of my job, it was my religion. Every conversation recorded or noted, every transaction tracked, every inconsistency cataloged and cross-referenced. Theodore used to joke that I kept better records of our grocery receipts than most businesses kept of their annual budgets. When I retired 5 years ago, I didn't just walk away from my career. I walked away with a pension that most people would envy. I also walked away with something else. A network of professional contacts that spanned law enforcement, financial institutions, and legal services. When you spend 4 decades solving complex cases, you don't just make colleagues, you make allies. Former FBI agents who now run private security firms. Prosecutors who've moved into high-powered legal practices. Bank investigators who remember favors you did them 20 years ago. Police detectives who still call you for advice on financial crimes. What Cassandra saw when she looked at me was a grieving widow, isolated and vulnerable, sitting on valuable assets with no one to protect her interests. What she failed to recognize was a woman who had spent her entire professional life identifying people exactly like her. Theodore and I had been married for 45 years when he passed. He was an electrical engineer for the city's power company, methodical and gentle, with a laugh that could fill a room and hands that could fix anything. We'd met at a community college accounting class. I was working toward my criminal justice degree. He was taking business courses to advance at work. Our first date was studying for a statistics exam at the library. Our last conversation was him making me promise to not let anyone take advantage of me after he was gone. "Evie," he'd said, holding my hand in his hospital bed, his voice already weak from the treatments. "You're the smartest person I know, but you have one blind spot. You want to believe the best in people, especially family. Promise me you won't let kindness make you careless." I should have listened more carefully to that warning. When Benjamin was born, Theodore and I made a pact. We would give our son every advantage we could provide, but we would also teach him to stand on his own feet. We paid for his education through a master's degree in architecture. We helped him with the down payment on his first apartment. We celebrated every achievement and supported him through every setback. But we also made it clear that our resources weren't unlimited, and that we expected him to build his own life, make his own decisions, and take responsibility for his own choices. Benjamin had always been a sweet child, perhaps too sweet. In school, he was the kid who gave away his lunch money to bullies because he felt sorry for them. As an adult, he chose a profession that valued creativity over profit, married a woman who seemed more interested in his potential than his reality, and consistently made financial decisions based on optimism rather than practical planning. I loved my son deeply, but I wasn't blind to his weaknesses. Benjamin was a peacekeeper at heart, someone who would rather absorb conflict than confront it. He saw the best in everyone, sometimes to the point of naivete. When he first introduced me to Cassandra 6 years ago, I noticed immediately how she seemed to do most of the talking for both of them, how she had already made plans that Benjamin seemed surprised to hear about, how she spoke about their future with a certainty that didn't quite match the hesitation in his eyes. Cassandra herself was a study in carefully crafted presentation, 38 years old, with the kind of polished appearance that requires significant time and money to maintain. She claimed to run a strategic consulting business, helping small companies optimize their operational frameworks, a description so vague it could mean almost anything or nothing at all. Her references to clients were always anonymous: a major retailer, a growing tech startup, and her income seemed to fluctuate dramatically based on circumstances that were never quite explained. What I did notice with my trained investigator's eye was that Cassandra had an expensive lifestyle that didn't seem to correlate with any visible means of support. Designer handbags, regular salon appointments, a luxury car that was leased rather than owned, and a wardrobe that suggested someone with serious disposable income. When I casually asked about her business success, she was quick to deflect with comments about the consulting industry being very cyclical and building long-term client relationships rather than focusing on immediate profits. Emma, their daughter, was the bright spot in an otherwise concerning picture. 7 years old, with Benjamin's gentle nature and but even Emma became a tool in Cassandra's arsenal. "Emma needs stability," Cassandra would say whenever I questioned any of her decisions. "Emma needs consistency. We can't disrupt Emma's routine." Every conversation about household rules, financial contributions, or simple courtesy somehow became framed around what was best for Emma, making any disagreement seem selfish and unreasonable. The beautiful home that Theodore and I had built together, the home where we'd hosted dinner parties and holiday celebrations, where Benjamin had learned to walk and later brought his own child to visit, became a stage for Cassandra's performance. And I was being systematically recast from homeowner to house guest, from family matriarch to elderly dependent. But here's what Cassandra never understood. You don't spend 40 years investigating financial crimes without developing certain instincts. And my instincts were screaming that I was being set up for something much worse than simple disrespect. I just didn't realize how much worse until the night she locked me in my own basement. The living arrangement that would ultimately become my nightmare began 18 months ago, with what seemed like a perfectly reasonable family crisis. Benjamin called me on a rainy Thursday evening in March, his voice carrying that particular strain that only comes from financial desperation mixed with parental responsibility. "Mom, I need to ask you something, and I want you to know I hate having to ask," he'd said, the words tumbling out in a rush. "The firm is going through some restructuring. 3 of the senior partners are retiring, and they're consolidating projects. My position isn't being eliminated exactly, but they're cutting my salary by 30% while they, quote, reassess the market conditions." I listened quietly, my auditor's brain automatically calculating what a 30% salary reduction would mean for a family already living paycheck to paycheck in one of the most expensive rental markets in the state. Benjamin and Cassandra had been renting a 2-bedroom apartment in downtown Millfield for nearly 4 years, paying almost $3,000 a month for a space barely large enough for the 3 of them. At the same time, Benjamin continued, "Emma's school costs are going up next year. The public schools in our district have a waiting list for their gifted program, and Cassandra found this private academy that specializes in advanced learning. It's perfect for Emma, but the tuition is," he paused, and I could hear him swallowing hard. "It's $18,000 a year. $18,000 for elementary school." I bit my tongue to keep from asking why Emma couldn't attend the perfectly good public schools that had educated her father. Instead, I asked the practical questions. How long did he expect the salary reduction to last? Had he considered looking for positions with other firms? What were their current monthly expenses beyond rent? That's when Cassandra took the phone. "Evelyn, I know this is a difficult conversation," she said, her tone immediately shifting into what I would later recognize as her managing the situation voice. "Benjamin is being modest about how serious this is. His firm isn't just cutting salaries. They're preparing for a potential merger that could eliminate his position entirely. We've already looked into other opportunities, but the architectural market is incredibly competitive right now. Most firms are downsizing, not hiring." She painted a picture of an industry in crisis, of talented professionals struggling to find work, of families like theirs caught in an economic downturn through no fault of their own. She spoke about Emma's educational needs, about the importance of maintaining stability during uncertain times, about how much it would mean to have family support during this transitional period. "We've been thinking," Cassandra said, her voice taking on a tone of someone presenting a mutually beneficial business proposal, "about how this situation might actually be an opportunity for all of us. You've mentioned how quiet the house feels since Theodore passed, how you sometimes feel isolated out there on all that property. And we've been worried about you managing everything on your own, the maintenance, the yard work, the general upkeep of such a large home." The proposal, as Cassandra outlined it, sounded almost altruistic. They would move into my house temporarily, just until Benjamin's career situation stabilized. "Think of it as a collaborative arrangement," she said. "We help you maintain your independence and your beautiful home, and you help us weather this temporary financial storm." Emma would finally have a yard to play in, space to grow, and the chance to really bond with her grandmother. I should have said no immediately. Every instinct, honed by decades of investigating financial fraud, was screaming warnings about arrangements that sounded too good to be true. But Cassandra had expertly identified and exploited my 3 greatest vulnerabilities: my love for Benjamin, my desire to have a relationship with Emma, and my genuine loneliness in the wake of Theodore's death. "How long are we talking about?" I asked, trying to maintain some semblance of practical boundaries. 6 months, Benjamin said, taking the phone back. "Maybe 8 at the most. Just long enough for me to either get a position with another firm or for my current situation to stabilize. I promise, Mom, we're not looking to take advantage. We just need a little help getting back on our feet." 6 months. In hindsight, I realize that timeline was always fiction. You don't uproot your entire life, move your child to a new school district, and relocate all your belongings for a 6-month arrangement. But at the time, listening to my son's voice crack with stress and imagining Emma playing in the garden where Benjamin had once built fairy houses, 6 months seemed manageable. The move itself should have been another warning sign. When someone is temporarily staying in your home due to financial hardship, you expect them to arrive with modest belongings, grateful for the accommodation, and mindful of being guests in your space. What arrived at my house 3 weeks later was a convoy of moving trucks carrying enough furniture and belongings to stock a small department store. Cassandra supervised the move like a military operation, directing movers to place their king-size bedroom set in the master guest room, their dining room table in my formal dining room because it seats 8 instead of 6, and their entertainment center in the living room because our TV is newer and has better resolution. Within hours, my carefully arranged living spaces had been transformed into something unrecognizable. "I hope you don't mind the temporary rearranging," Cassandra said, watching my expression as movers carried my grandmother's antique armoire out to the garage to make room for their modern wardrobe. "We want to make sure Emma feels settled and at home. Children need consistency, especially during times of change." Emma herself seemed overwhelmed by the chaos, clinging to a stuffed rabbit and watching wide-eyed as her entire world was transplanted into mine. When I knelt down to her level and asked if she was excited about her new room, she nodded solemnly and whispered, "Mama says we're going to live here until Daddy's work gets better." By evening, my house looked like it had been invaded by pod people. The furniture was familiar but wrong, like seeing your face in a funhouse mirror. My kitchen counters were covered with their small appliances. My refrigerator was full of their food. My bookshelves displayed their picture frames alongside my own, creating an unsettling gallery of blended family memories. "This is going to be wonderful," Cassandra announced over dinner that first night, serving a meal she'd prepared using ingredients she'd brought and dishes that were now apparently ours to share. "Emma, isn't it nice to have so much space? And Evelyn, won't it be lovely to have the house full of life again?" I should have recognized the language pattern immediately. In all my years investigating fraud, I'd learned that con artists have a particular way of speaking that assumes consent rather than asking for it. They don't say, "Would you mind if we rearranged the furniture?" They say, "I hope you don't mind the temporary rearranging," creating a social obligation to agree retroactively with decisions that have already been made. But I was still operating under the assumption that this was a family help. The transformation began so subtly that I almost convinced myself I was being oversensitive. After all, when 3 additional people move into your home, some adjustment is inevitable. What I didn't expect was how systematically those adjustments would chip away at my autonomy, my comfort, and eventually my basic dignity within my own walls. It started with the morning coffee ritual. For 23 years, Theodore and I had shared the same routine: wake at 6:30, brew a pot of dark roast Colombian, and sit together at the kitchen island reading different sections of the newspaper while the sun came up through the east-facing windows. After Theodore passed, I had maintained that ritual religiously. It was my quiet time, my moment of peace before the day began, my way of feeling connected to the life we'd built together. The third morning after they moved in, I walked into my kitchen at 6:30 to find Cassandra already there, fully dressed and made up despite the early hour, standing at my coffee maker with an expression of mild annoyance. "Oh good, you're awake," she said without looking up from the machine she was obviously trying to figure out. "I was hoping you could show me how this antique thing works. Benjamin and I are used to a Keurig system. You know, single-serve pods? Much more efficient and hygienic than these big pots that sit around getting stale." I explained the simple process of measuring grounds and adding water, while she nodded with the patient expression of someone humoring an elderly relative's quaint habits. "The thing is," she continued, "Benjamin has early meetings on Tuesdays and Thursdays, and I have client calls that start at 7. We really need the kitchen to be functional first thing in the morning. Would it be possible for you to maybe adjust your schedule just a tiny bit? Perhaps come down around 8 instead? The request was presented so reasonably, wrapped in such practical concerns, that refusing would have seemed petty. Benjamin did have work obligations. Cassandra did have clients to serve. I was retired, after all, with no pressing schedule to maintain. What difference did 90 minutes make? Except that 90 minutes stretched into permanent exile from my own morning routine. By the second week, the kitchen was occupied from 6 until nearly 9 with Cassandra's elaborate breakfast preparations. Not just coffee, but protein smoothies that required extensive blending, elaborate egg dishes that used every burner on the stove, and what she called power bowls that involved 20 different ingredients spread across every inch of counter space. "I'm so sorry about the mess," she'd say each morning when I finally made my way downstairs, surveying the kitchen that looked like a small explosion had occurred. "I know it seems like a lot, but Benjamin's metabolism requires very specific nutrition to maintain his energy levels. And Emma needs a substantial breakfast to support her cognitive development. The brain uses 20% of the body's energy, you know." The coffee itself changed too. Instead of my familiar dark roast, the cabinet filled with exotic blends that Cassandra ordered online. Ethiopian single-origin beans, Hawaiian Kona Reserve, something called bulletproof coffee that apparently required adding butter and oil to achieve optimal mental clarity. When I asked about my usual brand, Cassandra looked genuinely puzzled. "Oh, didn't I mention? I did some research on coffee and seniors' health. That dark roast you were drinking has incredibly high acid content. Terrible for bone density and digestive issues. These lighter roasts are much gentler on aging systems. I thought I was doing you a favor by upgrading your coffee game." Every conversation followed this pattern. My preferences weren't being ignored or overruled. They were being improved, optimized, upgraded for my own benefit by someone who had clearly done research that I, in my old-fashioned ignorance, had failed to conduct myself. The television became another battleground disguised as family harmony. For years, I'd enjoyed watching the evening news followed by classic movie channels or PBS documentaries. My viewing habits were predictable and modest. An hour or two of programming that didn't require much intellectual energy after a day of reading or household projects. The thing about Emma, instead, our evening entertainment became educational programming that Emma could watch, nature documentaries with cheerful narration, science shows designed for children, and what Cassandra called mindful viewing choices. When I suggested that Emma could watch her programs earlier and then go to bed at a reasonable hour, leaving the evening for adult programming, Cassandra's expression suggested I'd proposed something vaguely inappropriate. "We're trying to maintain consistent family time," she explained. "It's important for Emma's emotional development to see the adults in her life making choices that prioritize her well-being. Besides, don't you want to spend quality time with your granddaughter?" The guilt was expertly applied. What kind of grandmother would choose the evening news over bonding with her granddaughter? What sort of person valued watching crime reports over educational programming that could benefit a child's development? Every protest I might have made was reframed as selfishness, as resistance to positive change, as evidence that I was stuck in outdated patterns that weren't serving anyone well. My reading chair in the sunroom became Emma's homework station because natural light is crucial for developing eyes, and the acoustics in here are perfect for concentration. My craft room was converted into Cassandra's home office because I need a dedicated space for client video calls, and this room has the best internet signal strength. When I pointed out that I had been using these spaces for specific purposes, Cassandra's response was always the same gentle, reasonable tone that made my objections sound unreasonable by comparison. "Of course you were using them, and we're not saying you can't continue to use them. We're just optimizing the space utilization so everyone's needs can be met more efficiently." Optimization, efficiency, family harmony. These words became the mantras that justified every encroachment, every loss of personal space, every erosion of the boundaries that had once made my house feel like home. The mail situation developed so gradually that I didn't notice it until the pattern was firmly established. Cassandra began intercepting deliveries, so you don't have to walk to the mailbox, sorting through correspondence, to help you prioritize what's important, and handling phone calls, because you seem tired lately, and I don't want people bothering you unnecessarily. My friends from the retirement community stopped calling as frequently. When I asked Cassandra about messages, she'd look thoughtful and say things like, "Oh, Mrs. Henderson called, but you were napping and she said it wasn't urgent." Or, "Your book club leader wanted to confirm next week's meeting, but I told her you weren't feeling up to it lately." "Wasn't feeling up to it" became Cassandra's standard explanation for why I was suddenly unavailable for activities I'd participated in for years. Garden club meetings, volunteer work at the Historical Society, coffee dates with neighbors, all gradually eliminated because I apparently wasn't feeling well enough to maintain my social obligations. The most insidious part was how Cassandra managed to make me complicit in my own isolation. When Mrs. Henderson did reach me directly and asked why I'd missed 3 garden club meetings, I found myself making excuses rather than admitting I hadn't known about them. When my doctor's office called to confirm an appointment I'd supposedly rescheduled, I went along with the change rather than creating confusion. Benjamin seemed oblivious to the systematic changes occurring in his childhood home. When he was present, which became increasingly rare as his work schedule apparently demanded longer hours and more client meetings, he appeared grateful for Cassandra's management of household operations. "It's so nice that Cassandra is helping you stay organized, Mom," he'd say. "I was worried about you handling everything alone." The few times I attempted to discuss my concerns with him, Benjamin's response was always gentle dismissal wrapped in concern for my adjustment difficulties. "Change is hard, Mom, especially at your age. But Cassandra really knows what she's doing with household management. Maybe try to be a little more flexible? We're all trying to make..." What I was actually experiencing was the systematic dismantling of my autonomy, executed with such skill that I began to question my own perceptions. Maybe I was being unreasonable. Maybe these changes were improvements. Maybe resistance to Cassandra's organizational systems was evidence that I was becoming the stereotypical, difficult elderly relative who clings to outdated routines. But late at night, lying in my own bed, in my own house that no longer felt like either, I could feel Theodore's presence like a whisper in the darkness. "Evie," his voice would echo in my memory, "you're the smartest person I know, but you have one blind spot. You want to believe the best in people, especially family." I was beginning to understand that my blind spot might cost me everything I had left. The conversation that would change everything happened on a gray October afternoon while Emma was at school and Benjamin was supposedly meeting with potential clients downtown. I was in the garden, trying to salvage what remained of Theodore's rose bushes after weeks of neglect, another casualty of my disrupted routines, when Cassandra appeared on the back patio with 2 steaming mugs, and that particular smile that I'd learned meant she had something important to discuss. "Evelyn, do you have a minute? I thought we should talk about some practical matters that have been on my mind," she said, settling into one of the wrought iron chairs with the easy confidence of someone entirely comfortable in their surroundings. "I brought you some of that chamomile tea you like." I accepted the mug gratefully, my hands still dirty from pulling weeds, and sat across from her with the wariness that had become my default state in recent weeks. Cassandra's practical conversations had a way of resulting in more changes to my daily life, more optimizations to routines I hadn't realized needed improving. "I've been thinking about the winter months," she began, her tone carrying the measured cadence of someone who had rehearsed this conversation. "This house is beautiful, but it's also quite large for someone to heat efficiently. And with Benjamin's income situation still uncertain, we're all going to need to be more mindful about expenses over the next few months." She paused to sip her tea, letting me process this opening gambit. I waited, having learned that Cassandra's conversations always had multiple layers, and the real purpose usually emerged after several minutes of reasonable-sounding preamble. "The thing is," she continued, "I've been researching energy efficiency for homes this size, and there are some simple adjustments we could make that would save everyone money while also being more environmentally responsible. For instance, did you know that heating unused rooms is one of the biggest sources of energy waste in older homes?" I had heated every room in this house for 37 years without considering it wasteful, but I nodded non-committally and waited for her to continue. "What I'm thinking is that we could temporarily close off some of the less essential spaces during the coldest months. The formal dining room, for example, we're already eating in the breakfast nook most of the time anyway. And that beautiful library of yours, which I know you treasure, but honestly, how often are you actually using it these days?" My blood chilled at the casual way she referred to Theodore's library as, quote, less essential. Those floor-to-ceiling shelves contained 40 years of carefully curated books, first editions that Theodore had hunted for in used bookstores across 3 states. Volumes of poetry and philosophy that had shaped our evening conversations for decades. The idea of closing it off felt like sealing away the intellectual heart of our home. "I use the library frequently," I said, trying to keep my voice level. "Theodore and I spent countless evenings there. It's where I do my reading, my correspondence, my—" Of course, Cassandra interrupted gently, "and I'm not suggesting you couldn't access it when you needed to. I'm just talking about not heating it constantly when it's not in active use. You could always bundle up for your reading time, or even better, we could create a cozy reading nook in the living room, where it's already warm and you'd have natural light from those beautiful windows." She made it sound so reasonable, so practical. "There's something else I wanted to discuss," Cassandra continued, setting down her mug and leaning forward with an expression of gentle concern. "I hope you don't mind me mentioning this, but I've noticed you seem a bit overwhelmed lately. With managing your finances, keeping track of appointments, staying on top of household maintenance issues. This was news to me. My finances were meticulously organized, as they had been for decades. My appointments were noted in the same-day planner system I'd used since Theodore and I were married. The household maintenance was minimal because we'd spent years ensuring everything was in excellent condition." "I'm not sure what you mean," I said carefully. "Well, for example, last week you forgot about that dentist appointment, the one that had to be rescheduled? And I noticed you seemed confused about which bills had been paid when that statement from the electric company arrived. Plus, didn't you mention having trouble remembering where you put your reading glasses?" Each example she cited was technically accurate but completely misrepresented. I had asked about rescheduling the dentist appointment myself when I realized it conflicted with a garden club meeting. The electric bill confusion had occurred because Cassandra had moved it from my usual filing spot to what she called a, quote, more logical location. And everyone over 60 occasionally misplaces their reading glasses. But the way Cassandra presented these incidents created a narrative of cognitive decline, of an elderly woman struggling with basic life management tasks that any responsible family member would naturally want to help address. "What I'm thinking," she said, her voice taking on the tone of someone offering a generous solution to a difficult problem, "is that it might be helpful if I took over some of these administrative burdens. Just temporarily while you're adjusting to having us here and dealing with the stress of all these changes." The word temporarily had lost all meaning in our household. Everything Cassandra implemented temporarily seemed to become permanent with remarkable speed. "Specifically," she continued, "I could handle your bill paying and financial organization. I have experience with complex budgeting from my consulting work, and I've already set up systems for managing our family expenses that could easily incorporate your household costs. It would actually be more efficient to have everything coordinated through one person." My hands went cold around the warm mug. In 43 years of investigating financial crimes, I had seen this exact scenario more times than I could count. The helpful family member or caregiver who gradually assumes control of an elderly person's finances, always with the best of intentions, always with reasonable explanations, always temporarily. I appreciate the offer, I said slowly, but I'm perfectly capable of managing my own finances. Oh, absolutely, Cassandra said quickly. I didn't mean to suggest you weren't capable. I just meant that it seems like an unnecessary stress when you have family here who could help shoulder some of these responsibilities. Think of it as delegating rather than giving up control. Delegating. Another word that sounded reasonable until you examined what it actually meant in practice. There's one more thing, she said, and her tone shifted slightly, becoming more serious. I've been researching estate planning and financial security for seniors, particularly women who are managing substantial assets alone. Did you know that elderly people are the fastest-growing demographic for financial fraud and identity theft? She pulled out her phone and began scrolling through what appeared to be bookmarked articles. The statistics are really frightening. Seniors lose billions of dollars every year to scammers who specifically target people in situations like yours, living alone. The best protection, she continued, is to have trusted family members involved in monitoring your accounts and transactions. Not controlling them, obviously, but just keeping an eye on things to make sure nothing suspicious is happening. I could set up alerts on your accounts, review statements for unusual activity, that sort of thing. I sat in silence, watching this performance with the same fascination I might have had observing a master criminal explaining their methods. Cassandra wasn't proposing to steal from me, not directly. She was proposing to become the gatekeeper of my financial life, the filter through which all my economic decisions would pass, the person who would determine what constituted suspicious activity worthy of my attention. I know it's a lot to think about, she said, misinterpreting my silence as contemplation rather than horror. Why don't we start small? Maybe just have me handle the utility bills and household expenses for now, and see how that works out. You could keep your personal accounts exactly as they are, but this way the monthly operational costs could be streamlined, and you wouldn't have to worry about keeping track of due dates and payment schedules. The phrase, "start small," sent alarm bells clanging in my head. Every financial takeover I'd ever investigated had started small. A little help with bill paying, some assistance with budgeting. Gradually increasing involvement until the victim found themselves completely dependent on their helper's goodwill and increasingly unable to access their own resources. I'll need to think about it, I said, standing up abruptly and gathering my gardening tools. Of course, take all the time you need, Cassandra replied, but there was something in her expression that suggested my thinking time would be limited, and that further conversations on this topic were inevitable. That night, I sat in my darkened bedroom with Theodore's photograph in my hands, finally allowing myself to acknowledge what my professional instincts had been screaming for weeks. I wasn't living with a family member who was going through financial difficulties. I was living with someone who was executing a long-term plan to gain control over my assets, my independence, and ultimately my life. The question was no longer whether Cassandra represented a threat. The question was how far she was willing to go to achieve her objectives, and what I was prepared to do to stop her. The evening of November 15th will be seared into my memory until the day I die. It was the night Cassandra finally revealed the true scope of her ambitions, and the night I learned exactly how far she was willing to go to silence anyone who stood in her way. I had spent the previous 3 weeks quietly documenting every conversation, every suggestion, every gradual encroachment on my autonomy. My old investigative habits had kicked in with a vengeance, and I'd begun treating my own home like a crime scene that needed careful evidence collection. I photographed the rearranged furniture, saved text messages, and started keeping a detailed journal of daily interactions hidden in the back of my bedroom closet. Most importantly, I had begun making discreet inquiries through my professional network. A former colleague in white-collar crime had helped me run background checks on both Benjamin and Cassandra, and what I discovered had turned my blood to ice water. Benjamin's architectural firm wasn't just experiencing financial difficulties. It had been hemorrhaging money for over 2 years, largely due to cost overruns on projects that Cassandra had convinced him to bid too low on as her strategic consulting advice. More disturbing was Cassandra's own financial history. She had been married twice before Benjamin, both times to men significantly older than herself, both marriages ending in contentious divorce. On the morning of the 15th, Cassandra announced that she would be hosting a dinner party that evening for, quote, some important potential clients who might be able to help Benjamin's career situation. The guest list, as she described it, included a real estate developer, a city planning commissioner, and several other influential figures in the local business community. I know it's short notice, she said, bustling around the kitchen with the manic energy of someone orchestrating a complex performance. But these opportunities don't wait for convenient timing. Benjamin needs to make connections with people who can actually help him rebuild his practice. The preparation consumed the entire house. Cassandra hired caterers, florists, and even a bartender for what she described as a, quote, networking dinner that could change our family's future. She spent the afternoon rearranging furniture to create better conversation spaces, setting up the formal dining room with my grandmother's china, and transforming my home into the backdrop for what she clearly saw as a crucial business event. I hope you don't mind, she said as I watched strangers moving my possessions around like stage props. But I think it would be better if you made yourself scarce this evening. These are all business conversations, very sophisticated networking, and... She paused delicately. Well, you know how elderly people can sometimes misunderstand professional discussions and interrupt with questions that aren't really relevant to the conversation? I stared at her, stunned by the casual cruelty of the dismissal. In my own home, I was being relegated to the status of a potentially embarrassing relative who couldn't be trusted to participate in adult conversations. This is my house, I said quietly. Of course it is, Cassandra replied, her tone carrying that familiar note of patient condescension. And we're so grateful that you're letting us use it for this important event. But you understand, don't you, that Benjamin's entire future might depend on making the right impression tonight? We can't afford to have anything go wrong. The implication was clear. My presence was a liability that could sabotage my own son's career prospects. Any protest I made would be selfish interference with Benjamin's chances for financial recovery. I was thinking, she continued, that you could spend the evening in the basement apartment. It's completely self-contained, you'd have your own space, and you wouldn't be disturbed by all the noise and commotion up here. The basement apartment. The beautiful guest suite that Theodore and I had created as a private retreat, with its own entrance, kitchenette, and sitting area. She was suggesting I exile myself to the basement of my own home so she could entertain strangers with my possessions and present herself as the lady of the house. I'll order you something nice for dinner, she added, as if offering room service would somehow make this arrangement acceptable. Chinese food, maybe? Or that Italian place you like. And there's a television down there, plus all those craft supplies we moved when I needed the office space. You could have a lovely, quiet evening working on your hobbies. Working on my hobbies. In the basement. While my daughter-in-law entertained guests in my living room with my china and my furniture. No, I said firmly. Absolutely not. Cassandra's expression flickered, just for a moment, and I caught a glimpse of something cold and calculating behind her usual mask of reasonable concern. Evelyn, please don't be difficult about this. You know how important tonight is for Benjamin. Then Benjamin can explain to his guests that this is my home and I live here, I replied. But that's exactly the problem, she said, her voice taking on an edge of frustration. These people are expecting to meet with a successful architectural team, not to deal with family complications. They need to see Benjamin as an independent professional, not as someone who's moved back in with his elderly mother because he can't afford his own housing. The mask was slipping. Beneath Cassandra's carefully constructed persona of helpful family member, I could see the calculating manipulator who viewed me as an obstacle to be managed or eliminated. I'm going to the basement, I said finally, not because I agreed with her reasoning, but because I needed time to think to plan, and to figure out how to protect. I stood there for a moment, turning the handle again and again, unable to quite process what was happening. The lock was new, a deadbolt that could only be operated from the upstairs side. When had that been installed? How had I not noticed construction work happening in my own home? I knocked on the door, gently at first, then more insistently. No response. The dinner party conversation continued above me, punctuated by bursts of laughter and the clinking of wine glasses. I was trapped in my own basement while strangers ate dinner off my grandmother's china in my dining room. I tried calling Benjamin's cell phone, but it went straight to voicemail. I tried calling Cassandra with the same result. Either they had turned off their phones or the basement's concrete walls were blocking the signal more than usual. For the first time in months, I felt actual fear. This wasn't just manipulation or psychological pressure. This was imprisonment. Cassandra had physically locked me away from my own home, my own possessions, my own life. I spent the next 4 hours pacing the basement, alternating between fury and calculation. Every 30 minutes I tried the door again, hoping someone would eventually unlock it. Every 30 minutes I was disappointed. But Cassandra had made a crucial mistake. In her eagerness to get me out of the way, she had overlooked one important detail. The basement apartment had its own exterior entrance, which I had a key for. More importantly, she had no idea that I had spent the previous week discreetly installing a security camera system that recorded directly to a cloud storage service, or that I had already contacted my lawyer about my growing concerns regarding financial elder abuse. When I finally heard car doors slamming and engines starting as the dinner party ended, I didn't wait to see if someone would remember to unlock the basement door. Instead, I used my own key to exit through the basement's exterior door and walked around to the front of my house. I had spent 4 hours locked in my own basement, and I was done being a victim. I pulled out my cell phone, which had perfect signal reception outside the concrete basement walls, and dialed 911. "I need to report that I've been illegally imprisoned in my own home," I told the dispatcher. "And I have evidence that my daughter-in-law is attempting to commit financial elder abuse." The police arrived within 15 minutes, just as Cassandra was discovering that her elderly problem had solved itself. The look on her face when she opened the front door to find me standing there with 2 police officers will remain one of my most treasured memories forever. The moment I saw those 2 police officers standing on my front porch, Officer Martinez, a serious-faced woman in her 30s, and Officer Chen, a veteran with graying temples and kind eyes, I felt something fundamental shift inside me. For months, I had been allowing myself to be gaslit, manipulated, and gradually erased from my own existence. Standing there in my own doorway with legal authority backing me up, I finally remembered who I was. I was Evelyn Rose Hartwell, and I had spent 4 decades bringing down people far more sophisticated than Cassandra. The initial police response was exactly what I had expected. They treated the situation as a domestic dispute, the kind of family disagreement that gets out of hand and requires official intervention to cool down tempers. Officer Martinez took notes while I explained about being locked in the basement, while Officer Chen spoke separately with Cassandra and Benjamin about their version of events. Cassandra's performance was masterful. She expressed shock and concern that I had felt trapped, explaining that the basement door had apparently malfunctioned and that she had no idea I was unable to get out. She painted a picture of an elderly woman who was becoming increasingly confused and paranoid, someone who misinterpreted normal household security measures as deliberate imprisonment. "Officer, I think there might be some confusion here." Benjamin stood behind her like a guilty shadow, nodding along with her explanations but unable to meet my eyes. When Officer Chen asked him directly about the locked door, Benjamin mumbled something about not realizing there was a problem and assuming I had chosen to stay downstairs for the evening. It was a convincing narrative, and I could see both officers beginning to categorize this as exactly what Cassandra wanted them to see: A family situation involving an elderly woman who was struggling with cognitive issues and misperceiving normal events as threats. That's when I played my first card. Officers, before we go any further, I think you should know that I'm a retired federal criminal investigator, I said calmly. I spent 43 years with the IRS Criminal Investigation Division, and I'm very familiar with elder abuse patterns and financial fraud schemes. What happened tonight wasn't a misunderstanding or a mechanical malfunction. It was a deliberate attempt to remove me from my own home while my daughter-in-law entertained strangers using my possessions and representing herself as the homeowner. I watched both officers' demeanor change immediately. A retired federal agent carries weight that a confused elderly widow does not. Officer Martinez stopped taking cursory notes and began asking specific, detailed questions about the timeline of events. Officer Chen requested to see the basement door lock and examine its mechanism. "Ma'am, can you show us exactly what happened with this door?" Officer Chen asked as we walked downstairs. The deadbolt was clearly new, with fresh screws and unstained hardware that contrasted sharply with the aged wood of the doorframe. More importantly, it was a one-way lock that could only be operated from the upstairs side. Not a security measure, but a containment device. "This lock wasn't here a week ago," I told them. "I use this basement apartment regularly, and I would have noticed if this type of hardware had been installed." Officer Martinez photographed the lock mechanism and the surrounding doorframe. "Mrs. Hartwell, do you have any documentation about home improvements or modifications that might have been made recently?" This was my moment. I had spent 3 weeks preparing for a confrontation I knew was coming, and I was ready. "Officers, I need to show you something," I said, leading them to the small desk where I kept my computer. I installed a security system several weeks ago because I was becoming concerned about my safety in this situation. The cloud-stored video footage was damning. Clear recordings of Cassandra directing workers to install the basement lock while I was at a doctor's appointment. Audio of her explaining to Benjamin that they needed, quote, better security measures to ensure my evening privacy during important business meetings. Most significantly, recorded conversations where she discussed her plans for gradually assuming control of my financial affairs and eventually having me declared incompetent. Officer Chen watched the footage with the grim expression of someone who had seen this pattern before. "Mrs. Hartwell, this appears to show premeditation. Your daughter-in-law deliberately installed a lock that would prevent you from accessing your own home." "That's just the beginning," I said, pulling out the folder I had prepared. "I have documented evidence of financial manipulation, social isolation, and what I believe to be a systematic plan to gain control of my assets through a guardianship proceeding." I showed them printouts of bank records that Cassandra had accessed without permission, medical appointment changes she had made claiming I was experiencing cognitive decline, and correspondence with attorneys that I had intercepted where she inquired about the process of having someone declared incompetent. The transformation in the room was palpable. What had started as a domestic dispute call had become a potential criminal investigation. Officer Martinez was now taking detailed photographs of documents, while Officer Chen called for a detective to respond to the scene. That's when Cassandra made her fatal mistake. Up until this point, she had maintained her composed, concerned family member act. But when she realized that the police were taking my allegations seriously, when she saw them photographing evidence and calling for detectives, her carefully constructed mask finally cracked. "This is ridiculous," she snapped, storming into the basement where we were examining the lock. "She's a confused old woman who doesn't understand what's happening in her own house. We've been bending over backwards to take care of her, and this is how she repays us? By making up paranoid fantasies about being imprisoned?" Officer Chen looked up from the lock mechanism he was examining. "Ma'am, can you explain why this deadbolt was installed in a way that can only be operated from upstairs?" "For security reasons," Cassandra said quickly. "There have been break-ins in the neighborhood, and we wanted to make sure the basement entrance was properly secured. But this lock doesn't secure the basement entrance from outside intrusion," Officer Martinez pointed out. "It prevents someone in the basement from accessing the main house. Can you explain the security benefit of that configuration?" I watched Cassandra's mind race as she tried to construct an explanation that would make sense to trained law enforcement officers. The silence stretched for nearly 30 seconds before she finally said, "I don't have to explain our security choices to you. This is our home, and we have the right to protect it however we see fit." Our home. She had finally said it out loud. "Actually, ma'am," Officer Chen said quietly, "according to the property records we verified, this home belongs entirely to Mrs. Hartwell. You're listed as a resident, not an owner. So security modifications that restrict the homeowner's access to her own property could constitute unlawful imprisonment." The color drained from Cassandra's face as she realized the legal ground was shifting beneath her feet. She looked around the basement as if seeing it clearly for the first time, not as her domain to control, but as evidence of her own criminal behavior. "I want to speak to a lawyer," she said finally. "That's certainly your right," Officer Martinez replied. "In the meantime, you'll need to unlock any other doors or areas of this house that have been modified to restrict Mrs. Hartwell's access." As we walked back upstairs, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months. Hope. Not just hope that this nightmare would end, but the certainty that I was no longer fighting this battle alone. I had law enforcement on my side, documentation to support my claims, and most importantly, I had remembered my own strength. But I also knew that calling the police was just the first move in what would become a much larger game. Cassandra wasn't going to go quietly, and Benjamin was going to be forced to choose between his mother and his wife in a way that would define our relationship forever. The real battle was just beginning. The 48 hours following the police intervention were a whirlwind of strategic preparation that reminded me exactly why I had been so effective at bringing down financial criminals during my federal career. Every instinct I had developed over 4 decades of investigation work kicked into high gear, and I approached the situation with the methodical precision of someone building a case that would need to withstand serious legal scrutiny. The first order of business was securing my immediate safety and legal position. Before the police had even finished their initial report, I was on the phone with my attorney, Thomas Brennan, who had handled Theodore's estate and had been my legal counsel for over 15 years. Tom was a sharp, no-nonsense lawyer who specialized in elder law and had seen enough financial abuse cases to recognize the red flags immediately. "Evelyn, what you're describing fits a very specific pattern that we see in about 30% of elder abuse cases," he told me during our emergency meeting the next morning. "The perpetrator moves into the victim's home under the guise of providing help, gradually assumes control of daily operations, then begins restricting access and isolating the victim from outside support systems. The basement incident was likely a test run to see if they could physically control your movements without triggering legal intervention." Tom's assessment was both validating and terrifying. I wasn't being paranoid or oversensitive. I was dealing with someone who... Our first strategic move was to secure my financial assets. Within 24 hours, Tom had helped me change all my banking passwords, establish new accounts at a different institution, and implement additional security measures on all my investment accounts. We also filed paperwork to revoke any power of attorney documents that might have been forged in my name, and requested detailed account activity reports going back 6 months to identify any unauthorized transactions. The results were worse than I had expected. Cassandra had somehow gained access to my main checking account and had been making small withdrawals and transfers that totaled nearly $8,000 over the past 3 months. The amounts were carefully calculated to stay below the thresholds that would trigger automatic fraud alerts, but the pattern was unmistakable when viewed in aggregate. "This is textbook financial abuse," Tom said, reviewing the bank statements. "Small, regular withdrawals that could be explained away as legitimate household expenses, but which constitute theft when taken without permission. We have grounds for both civil and criminal action here." While Tom handled the legal aspects, I focused on gathering additional evidence and building a comprehensive record of Cassandra's behavior. My background in criminal investigation had taught me that successful prosecutions depend on overwhelming documentation, not just isolated incidents that could be dismissed as misunderstandings. I retrieved the digital recorder I had used during my federal career and began documenting every conversation, every interaction, every change in household routine. I photographed the current state of my home, noting which of my possessions had been moved, removed, or replaced with Cassandra's belongings. I compiled a timeline of all the improvements and optimizations she had implemented since moving in, showing the clear pattern of control and isolation. Most importantly, I began reaching out to my professional network to verify information about Benjamin's supposed business difficulties and Cassandra's consulting work. Within 2 days, I had confirmed that virtually everything they had told me about their financial situation was either exaggerated or completely fabricated. Benjamin's architectural firm was struggling, but not because of market conditions or unreasonable clients. According to a colleague who still worked in the industry, Benjamin had developed a reputation for taking on projects without proper cost analysis, largely because he was receiving business advice from someone with no actual experience in architecture or construction management. Several clients had complained about cost overruns and missed deadlines, and Benjamin's professional reputation was suffering as a result. Cassandra's consulting business was even more questionable. I had a former FBI colleague run a comprehensive background check, and what we discovered was alarming. The business address listed on her tax returns was a mail drop service. The client testimonials on her website were fabricated. Her supposed expertise in strategic optimization had never been applied to any verifiable business situation. More disturbing was her personal history. My colleague uncovered court records showing that Cassandra had been involved in 3 previous elder abuse investigations in different states, though charges had never been filed due to insufficient evidence or victims who were too intimidated to testify. She appeared to be a career predator who specialized in targeting recently widowed women with substantial assets. Evelyn, my FBI contact, told me during a confidential phone call, "This woman is dangerous." Not physically dangerous necessarily, but she's incredibly sophisticated in psychological manipulation. She's had years to perfect these techniques, and she specifically targets people in vulnerable emotional states. Armed with this information, Tom and I developed a comprehensive legal strategy. We would file for a restraining order that would require Cassandra to maintain distance from me and my financial accounts. We would pursue criminal charges for the financial theft and unlawful imprisonment. Most importantly, we would seek immediate removal of both Cassandra and Benjamin from my property. The restraining order hearing was scheduled for the following Tuesday, but Cassandra's behavior over the weekend made it clear that we were running out of time for a measured, legal approach to the situation. She had initially responded to. She began playing loud music at all hours, claiming it was necessary for her meditation and stress management. She invited strangers into the house for what she called consultation meetings, filling my living spaces with people I didn't know and conversations I wasn't included in. Most aggressively, she started intercepting all my phone calls and mail, claiming that the police investigation had made her concerned about my mental stability and that family members needed to monitor my communications for signs of confusion or paranoia. When I confronted her about these behaviors, her response was swift and chilling. "Evelyn, I understand you're upset about the misunderstanding the other night," she said with the cold smile I had learned to fear. "But you need to be very careful about making accusations that could damage your own credibility. People are starting to wonder if the stress of Theodore's death has affected your judgment more than anyone realized." The threat was clear. If I continued to challenge her authority, she would escalate her campaign to have me declared mentally incompetent. She had already laid the groundwork by intercepting my medical communications and social contacts. Now she was positioning herself to claim that my allegations of abuse were actually symptoms of dementia or psychological breakdown. That's when I realized that legal proceedings, while necessary, were going to take too long to protect me from immediate harm. I needed to take more aggressive action to secure my safety and preserve my independence. Sunday evening, while Cassandra was out with another group of mysterious clients, and Benjamin was hiding in his room avoiding the escalating conflict, I began implementing the final phase of my plan. I started by transferring the majority of my liquid assets to accounts that Cassandra had no knowledge of, using banking relationships I had established during my federal career. I arranged for a private security company to install additional monitoring equipment that would be virtually undetectable, but would provide real-time documentation of any further abuse. Most importantly, I called my FBI contact and asked for an urgent meeting. If Cassandra was a career criminal who had operated across state lines, this situation might qualify for federal investigation under elder abuse statutes. It was time to stop playing defense and start using every resource I had accumulated over 4 decades of bringing down sophisticated criminals. The game was about to change, and Cassandra had no idea what she was really up against. The unraveling began exactly as I had predicted it would. Without my daily financial contributions, household management, and emotional support systems, the carefully constructed facade that Cassandra had built around our happy family arrangement started cracking within a week of my decision to stop enabling their manipulation. The first sign of trouble was the utilities. For months, I had been quietly paying the increased electrical, water, and heating bills that came with housing 3 additional people in my home. Cassandra had presented these higher costs as unavoidable consequences of family living, while simultaneously arguing that my fixed income meant we all needed to be more careful about expenses. The contradiction had always annoyed me, but I had absorbed the additional costs rather than create conflict over money. When I stopped automatically covering these bills, the reality of their financial situation became impossible to hide. The electric company sent a disconnect notice after Benjamin and Cassandra's checking account bounced on their agreed-upon contribution to household expenses. The heating oil delivery service called to inform me that their payment method had been declined, and did I want to authorize emergency delivery to avoid service interruption during the approaching winter months? "Evelyn, we have a small cash flow problem," Cassandra announced on a Tuesday morning, standing in my kitchen with an expression that managed to combine sheepishness with entitlement. "Benjamin's biggest client is late on their payment schedule, and our account is temporarily low. Could you cover the utilities this month, just until we get caught up?" I looked up from my newspaper and coffee, the morning routine I had finally reclaimed after months of exile, and said simply, "I understand you're still upset about the misunderstanding last week," she said, her voice taking on the patient tone of someone addressing a difficult child. "But we're all family here, and families help each other through temporary difficulties. You know we'll pay you back as soon as Benjamin's situation stabilizes." "I'm not upset," I replied calmly. "I'm simply no longer subsidizing your lifestyle choices. You can arrange your own utility payments like any other adult tenants would." The word tenants clearly stung. Cassandra had spent months presenting herself as a co-equal member of the household, someone who contributed as much as she received. The suggestion that she was merely renting space in my home undermined the entire narrative she had constructed about our living arrangement. By Thursday, the internet service had been disconnected for non-payment. By Friday, we received a notice that the cable television would be shut off the following week. Cassandra's response was to dramatically increase her demands for financial assistance, while simultaneously escalating her psychological pressure tactics. "This is really about control, isn't it?" she said, during a particularly tense confrontation in the living room Saturday morning. "You're punishing Benjamin and Emma because you're angry at me. You're willing to make your own granddaughter suffer because you can't handle sharing your space with other adults." The manipulation was expertly crafted. She was positioning me as the aggressor, the unreasonable elderly woman who was being petty and vindictive at the expense of innocent family members. She was also making the conflict about my relationship with Benjamin and Emma, rather than about her systematic abuse of my hospitality and resources. But I had spent 40 years recognizing and deflecting manipulation tactics far more sophisticated than anything Cassandra could devise. "Emma is welcome in my home any time," I said evenly. "You and Benjamin are adults who chose to move in here temporarily and then chose to treat my generosity as an entitlement. Those were your choices, and the consequences are yours to manage. The most telling change was in Benjamin's behavior. For months, he had been a largely passive figure in the household dynamics, going along with Cassandra's decisions and avoiding direct confrontation with either of us. But as their financial situation deteriorated and the reality of their dependence became undeniable, he began showing signs of the stress and resentment that he had been suppressing. He started working later hours, supposedly meeting with potential clients or pursuing new business opportunities, but I suspected he was simply avoiding being home during the increasingly frequent arguments between Cassandra and me. When he was present, he moved through the house like a ghost, unable to make eye contact with anyone and responding to direct questions with mumbled non-answers. The breaking point came when Emma's school called to inform us that tuition for the next semester was overdue. The prestigious private academy that Cassandra had insisted was essential for Emma's intellectual development required payment in advance, and their check had been returned for insufficient funds. "We need $18,000 by Monday, or Emma loses her spot at Meridian Academy," Cassandra announced during what she dramatically called an emergency family meeting Sunday evening. This is exactly the kind of situation where family members help each other out. "Evelyn, you have the resources to solve this problem immediately." I looked at Benjamin, who was staring at his hands like they contained the secrets of the universe. "Benjamin, do you have something to say about your daughter's education costs?" He finally raised his eyes to meet mine, and I saw something I hadn't seen in months: awareness. Not just of the immediate financial crisis, but of the larger pattern of dependence and manipulation that had brought us to this point. "Mom," he said quietly, "I don't know what to do. I've been trying to rebuild my practice, but every decision I make seems to make things worse. The clients Cassandra helps me find turn out to be problematic. The projects she advises me to bid on lose money. I'm starting to wonder if—" He trailed off. The mask was finally slipping completely. The reasonable, helpful family member was being replaced by someone whose sense of entitlement had been challenged, and who was no longer bothering to hide her contempt for anyone who stood in her way. "I've sacrificed my own business opportunities to focus on Benjamin's career," she continued, her voice rising. "I've put my own financial security at risk to support this family. And now, when we need help the most, you're going to destroy Emma's educational future because you're too selfish to share your wealth with your own family?" I stood up slowly, recognizing that we had reached the moment I had been preparing for. "Cassandra, I want you and Benjamin to be out of my house by the end of this week." The silence that followed was deafening. Benjamin looked like he had been physically struck. Cassandra's face went through a rapid series of calculations as she realized that her carefully orchestrated campaign had backfired. "You can't be serious," she said finally. "We have nowhere to go. Emma is settled in school here. Benjamin's business contacts are all in this area. You can't just throw your own family out on the street because you're having some kind of emotional breakdown." "I can, and I am," I replied. "This is my house, and you are no longer welcome in it." That's when Cassandra played her final card, the one I had been expecting for weeks. "Benjamin, are you going to let your mother do this to us? Are you going to choose her over your own wife and daughter?" The moment of truth had arrived. Benjamin would have to decide whether to continue enabling Cassandra's manipulation or finally acknowledge what she had been doing to our family. His answer would determine not just the immediate resolution of this crisis, but the future of our relationship forever. Benjamin's response to Cassandra's ultimatum was perhaps the most heartbreaking moment of this entire ordeal. He sat in my living room, staring at his hands while his wife demanded that he choose between his mother and his family, and I watched 43 years of careful parenting crumble under the weight of his inability to confront the truth about his marriage. "Mom," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper, "couldn't we work something out? Maybe if we all just tried a little harder to get along? Cassandra has some good ideas about managing the household expenses, and you could probably benefit from having help with the day-to-day stuff." Even in this moment of crisis, he was still trying to find a middle ground that would allow him to avoid taking a definitive stand. He was suggesting that I should compromise with someone who had stolen from me, imprisoned me, and was systematically working to gain control of my assets. He was asking me to be reasonable about my own abuse. "Benjamin," I said quietly, "your wife has been stealing money from my bank accounts. She locked me in my own basement. She's been intercepting my mail and medical communications. This isn't a personality conflict that can be resolved with better communication." Cassandra immediately went into damage control mode. "Those are very serious accusations, and I think Benjamin needs to consider the source. Evelyn has been under tremendous stress since Theodore's death, and sometimes grief can manifest as paranoia and false memories. These aren't unusual symptoms in elderly people who are struggling to adjust to major life changes." The gaslighting was masterful. She was simultaneously denying my allegations and providing a medical explanation for why I might be making them. Anyone listening who didn't have access to the evidence I had gathered might reasonably conclude that I was indeed an elderly widow whose judgment had been compromised by grief and isolation. Benjamin wanted desperately to believe this explanation. I could see it in his face. The relief that flooded his expression at being offered a narrative that didn't require him to acknowledge his wife's criminal. Dr. Patterson was my family physician, someone I had been seeing for 15 years, and who knew me well enough to recognize any legitimate changes in my cognitive function. But he was also someone Cassandra had been in contact with, claiming to be concerned about my mental state and requesting that he monitor me for signs of dementia or depression. "I don't need a medical evaluation," I said firmly. "I need you to look at the evidence I've gathered and make an adult decision about what's been happening in this house." That's when I made the strategic decision to show Benjamin the bank records, the recorded conversations, and the documentation I had compiled over the past month. I spread it all out on the coffee table like a prosecutor presenting evidence to a jury, which, in a very real sense, was exactly what I was doing. The bank statements showed the pattern of unauthorized withdrawals. The audio recordings captured Cassandra discussing her plans to have me declared incompetent. The photographs documented the systematic takeover of my living spaces and the installation of the basement lock. The background check revealed her history of targeting vulnerable elderly women in other states. Benjamin examined each piece of evidence with the expression of someone watching his world collapse in real time. I could see him struggling to reconcile the woman he had married with the calculating predator revealed in these documents. More painfully, I could see him recognizing his own role in enabling this situation through his willful blindness and conflict avoidance. This can't be right," he said finally, but his voice carried no conviction. "Cassandra wouldn't. She loves our family. She's been trying to help." Cassandra's response was to immediately attack the evidence itself. "These documents have been taken out of context," she said, her voice taking on the indignant tone of someone falsely accused. "Yes, I've been concerned about Evelyn's financial management, but only because I love this family and want to protect everyone from making mistakes that could hurt us all. And yes, I've spoken with Dr. Patterson about her behavior, but only because Benjamin and I have been worried about her welfare. She was good, I had to admit." Even confronted with overwhelming evidence of her manipulation, she was managing to reframe every action as motivated by love and concern rather than personal gain. "Benjamin," she continued, "your mother is asking you to choose between the evidence of your own eyes and some documents that could have been altered or misrepresented. You've lived with me for 6 years. You know who I am. Are you really going to let her destroy our marriage based on her paranoid interpretations of normal family behavior?" This was the moment I had been dreading but knew was inevitable. Benjamin would have to choose between accepting an uncomfortable truth about his wife or maintaining the comfortable fiction that had allowed him to avoid difficult decisions for months. He chose fiction. "Mom," he said, not meeting my eyes, "I think maybe you are having some kind of episode. Maybe the stress of having us here has been too much, and you're interpreting normal situations as threatening. Cassandra and I love you, and we want to help, but not if you're going to keep making these accusations." The betrayal was complete and devastating. My own son was choosing to believe that I was mentally unstable rather than acknowledging that his wife was a criminal. He was choosing his abuser over his mother. In that case, I said, standing up and gathering my evidence, you've made your choice. I want both of you out of my house within 72 hours. Mom, please don't do this, Benjamin said, suddenly realizing that his attempt to avoid conflict had created a much larger one. We don't have anywhere to go. Emma needs stability. Can't we just agree to disagree and find a way to coexist? But Cassandra, sensing victory, she was positioning herself as the protective parent, shielding her child from an unstable grandmother. It was a brilliant tactical move that would simultaneously isolate me from Emma and give Cassandra moral authority as the reasonable adult protecting innocent family members from my allegedly erratic behavior. What Cassandra is saying, Benjamin added, clearly following her lead, is that maybe we all need some space to cool down. We'll find somewhere else to stay temporarily, but I think it would be best if you didn't try to contact us until you've gotten some professional help. Professional help. They were both now committed to the narrative that I was mentally ill and potentially dangerous. Any future contact I attempted would be evidence of my instability. Any legal action I took would be dismissed as the paranoid delusions of an elderly woman who couldn't accept that her family was trying to help her. It was a masterful manipulation, and if I hadn't spent 40 years investigating exactly these kinds of schemes, it might have worked. Instead, I smiled calmly and said, "That won't be necessary. By Thursday evening, you'll be dealing with law enforcement officers who will be very interested in the evidence I've gathered. I suggest you use the next 3 days to find legal representation." The look of shock on both their faces told me everything I needed to know. They had assumed that cutting me off from family contact would end my ability to pursue the matter further. They had underestimated exactly how much legal authority a retired federal investigator could mobilize when armed with comprehensive evidence of criminal behavior. Their game was about to end, and mine was just beginning. The 72-hour countdown I had given them turned into the most intense period of strategic warfare I had experienced since my days investigating organized crime families. But this time, the stakes were deeply personal, and the adversary was someone who had been living in my home, studying my routines, and planning my destruction from within my own walls. Cassandra's response to my ultimatum was swift and vicious. Within hours of our confrontation, she had launched what could only be described as a comprehensive character assassination campaign designed to discredit me before I could mobilize legal action against her. Her strategy was brilliant in its simplicity. If she could establish a public narrative that I was mentally unstable and potentially dangerous, any accusations I made against her would be dismissed as the paranoid delusions of an elderly woman experiencing cognitive decline. The campaign began with phone calls to my neighbors, expressing, quote, concern about my recent behavior and asking if they had noticed any signs that I might be struggling with mental health issues. She called my doctor's office to report that I had been making accusations against family members and seemed to be experiencing paranoid episodes. She even contacted my former colleagues at the IRS to suggest that I might be suffering from dementia and could potentially embarrass myself or the agency if I continued making public statements about ongoing investigations. Most insidiously, she called Emma's school to report that there was a family crisis involving my mental health, and that I should not be allowed to pick up Emma or have any unsupervised contact with her until the situation was resolved. She presented herself as the responsible parent protecting her child from an unstable grandmother who might pose a safety risk. But Cassandra made a crucial error in her calculations. She assumed that I was an isolated elderly woman with limited resources and no professional support network. She didn't realize that I had spent the past month building a comprehensive legal case with the help of attorneys, law enforcement contacts, and private investigators who specialized in elder abuse cases. When Tom Brennan received calls questioning my mental competency, his response was to immediately escalate our legal timeline. "Evelyn, they're trying to get ahead of the story," he told me during an emergency meeting Tuesday morning. "This is a classic perpetrator tactic, Discredit the victim before formal charges can be filed. We need to move faster than originally planned. By Tuesday afternoon, the private investigator I had hired delivered his preliminary report Tuesday evening, and the results were even more damaging to Cassandra than I had hoped. He had uncovered evidence that she was currently running similar schemes against 2 other elderly women in neighboring counties, using variations of the same tactics she had employed against me. More importantly, he had found evidence that she had been planning this specific operation for over a year, researching my financial situation and family relationships through social media and public records long before Benjamin ever suggested moving in with me. Wednesday morning brought the first sign that our legal offensive was having the desired effect. Detective Sarah Walsh from the County Financial Crimes Unit arrived at my house with a warrant to search for evidence of elder abuse and financial fraud. The search was comprehensive and professional, focusing particularly on documents, computer records, and any physical evidence of the modifications Cassandra had made to my home without permission. The basement lock became a central piece of evidence. Detective Walsh brought a forensics technician who documented the installation date based on hardware aging and photographed the mechanism from multiple angles. More importantly, they discovered that Cassandra had installed similar locks on 2 other interior doors, the library and my bedroom, that could be operated only from the outside. Mrs. Hartwell, Detective Walsh said as we reviewed the evidence, this appears to be a systematic plan to control your movement within your own home, combined with the financial theft and the documented attempts to isolate you from outside support. We're looking at a very serious case of elder abuse. The detective's next step was to interview Cassandra and Benjamin separately about their version of events. I wasn't present for these interviews, but Tom was able to obtain transcripts through the discovery process, and the results were revealing. Benjamin's interview showed a man who was genuinely confused about the extent of Cassandra's activities. He admitted that he had been aware she was helping me with financial management, but claimed he didn't know she was making unauthorized withdrawals. He acknowledged that the basement incident had troubled him, but said Cassandra had convinced him it was a mechanical malfunction rather than deliberate imprisonment. Most importantly, when presented with the evidence of Cassandra's previous elder abuse investigations in other states, Benjamin appeared genuinely shocked. I had no idea about any of that, he told the detective. Cassandra told me her previous marriages ended because of incompatibility issues, not because of legal problems. Cassandra's interview was a masterclass in deflection and victim blaming. She maintained that all her actions had been motivated by concern for my welfare and that my accusations were the result of paranoid delusions brought on by grief and social isolation. She claimed that the unauthorized bank withdrawals were reimbursements for household expenses she had paid on my behalf, and that she had documentation to support these claims. When asked about the basement lock, she insisted it had been installed for security purposes, and that I had been informed about the modification. She suggested that my claim of being imprisoned was either a false memory or a deliberate fabrication designed to gain sympathy and attention. But when Detective Walsh presented her with evidence of her background investigations of me prior to Benjamin's supposed business crisis, Cassandra's carefully constructed narrative began to fall apart. Phone records showed she had been researching my financial situation and property values months before Benjamin lost his architectural contract. Internet search histories revealed extensive research into elder abuse tactics and guardianship laws. Most damaging was the Thursday morning, Detective Walsh called to inform me that they were ready to make arrests. Mrs. Hartwell, we have enough evidence to charge Cassandra with multiple felonies, including theft, elder abuse, and conspiracy to commit fraud. Benjamin appears to have been largely unaware of the extent of his wife's activities, but he may face charges related to the financial aspects of the scheme. The arrest warrant was executed Thursday afternoon while I was safely away from the house, staying with my sister Rosa to avoid any potential confrontation. According to Detective Walsh, Cassandra was taken into custody without incident, though she continued to maintain her innocence and claimed that the charges were the result of my mental instability and vindictive nature. Benjamin was not arrested, but was informed that he was a person of interest in the ongoing investigation. More immediately, he was served with the restraining order requiring both him and Cassandra to vacate my property and maintain no contact with me, pending resolution of the criminal case. When I returned to my house Thursday evening, accompanied by Tom and a sheriff's deputy, I found it exactly as I had left it except for one detail: a letter on my kitchen counter from Benjamin. "Mom," it read, "I don't know what to believe anymore, but I'm starting to understand that I've been blind to things I should have seen. I'm sorry for not protecting you, and I'm sorry for not believing you when you tried to tell me what was happening. I don't know if you'll ever be able to forgive me, but I want you to know that I love you and I never wanted any of this to happen." It was the first honest communication I had received from my son in months, and despite everything that had occurred, it gave me hope that our relationship might eventually be repaired. But first, there was still one more move to make in this deadly game Cassandra had started. 3 months later, as I sit in my garden on a crisp February morning, watching the first crocuses push through the snow where Theodore's roses will bloom again come spring, I can barely recognize the frightened, isolated woman I had become during those dark months when Cassandra controlled my life. The transformation back to myself wasn't immediate or easy, but it was complete and irreversible. The legal resolution came faster than Tom had predicted. Faced with overwhelming evidence and the testimony of 2 other elderly victims in neighboring counties, Cassandra accepted a plea agreement rather than risk a jury trial that could have resulted in decades in prison. She was sentenced to 5 years in state prison for elder abuse, financial fraud, and conspiracy, followed by 5 years of supervised probation. More importantly for my peace of mind, the plea agreement included full restitution of the money she had stolen, plus substantial damages for the emotional distress and property violations. Benjamin was not charged criminally, but he was required to testify against Cassandra as part of her prosecution. The experience of seeing the evidence laid out in court, of hearing testimony from her other victims, of confronting the systematic nature of her predatory behavior, finally opened his eyes to the reality of what his wife had been doing. During his testimony, he broke down completely when describing how Cassandra had manipulated him into enabling her abuse of his own mother. "I thought I was protecting my family," he told the court, his voice barely audible. "I thought my mother was being difficult, and that Cassandra was trying to help everyone get along. I never imagined that someone I loved could be capable of this kind of calculated cruelty." The divorce proceedings began while Cassandra was still awaiting sentencing. Benjamin discovered that virtually everything she had told him about her background, her business experience, and her previous relationships had been fabricated. Her consulting business had never had legitimate clients. Her financial advice had been designed to sabotage his architectural practice and create the dependency that made their scheme possible. Even her supposed love for Emma had been performance art designed to give her leverage over Benjamin's emotions and decisions. The most difficult part of the recovery process, Benjamin moved into a modest apartment across town and began the difficult process of rebuilding his architectural practice without Cassandra's, quote, strategic advice. The work was slow and humbling, but for the first time in years, his projects were profitable, and his professional reputation began to recover. More importantly, he committed himself to understanding how he had been manipulated and to developing the emotional intelligence that would prevent him from being victimized again. Our first conversation after Cassandra's arrest was awkward and painful. Benjamin came to my house with Emma for what he called the apology I should have made months ago. He sat in my living room, now restored to the way Theodore and I had arranged it decades earlier, and tried to explain how Cassandra had systematically isolated him from his own judgment and moral compass. "She made everything seem reasonable," he said, struggling to find words for the psychological manipulation he had experienced. "Every time you raised concerns, she had explanations that made sense. Every time I felt uncomfortable about something, she convinced me that I was being oversensitive or disloyal to our marriage. By the time I realized what was happening, I felt like I couldn't trust my own perceptions anymore." I listened to his explanation with the professional detachment I had learned during 40 years of investigating complex criminal cases. Benjamin had been a victim too, though his victimization didn't excuse his failure to protect me from someone he had brought into my home. Understanding the dynamics of manipulation didn't automatically restore trust or forgiveness. Benjamin, I told him, I understand that Cassandra was skilled at psychological control, but you're a grown man who chose to believe her version of events over your own mother's experience. That choice had consequences, and those consequences can't be undone simply by explaining how you were manipulated. The honesty was harsh but necessary. Our relationship needed to be rebuilt on a foundation of truth, rather than convenient explanations that minimized the harm that had been done. Emma, innocent of the adult complexities that had nearly destroyed our family, became the bridge that eventually allowed Benjamin and me to find our way back to each other. She had been confused and frightened by the chaos of the arrest, the divorce, and the dramatic change in living arrangements, but she was also resilient in the way that children can be when the adults in their lives finally start making healthy decisions. "Grandma Evelyn," she asked during one of our supervised visits, "are you and Daddy going to be friends again?" The question was simple, but the answer required months of careful work. We started with structured visits, always with Emma present, always focused on rebuilding the ordinary rhythms of family life rather than processing the trauma we had all experienced. Gradually, Benjamin and I learned to have conversations that didn't revolve around Cassandra's manipulation or our mutual hurt feelings. The real breakthrough came when Benjamin asked if I would help him understand how to recognize and resist manipulation in future relationships. "I don't want to ever be that vulnerable again," he said. "I don't want to bring someone into Emma's life who could hurt her the way Cassandra hurt you." That request opened the door to a different kind of relationship between us. Instead of the traditional mother-son dynamic where I offered advice and he politely ignored it, we became allies in protecting our family from predators who specialized in exploiting good intentions and family loyalty. Today, a year after Cassandra's sentencing, my life has settled into rhythms that feel both familiar and entirely new. I wake up in my own bedroom, drink coffee in my own kitchen, and spend my evenings in Theodore's library reading books that no one has declared inappropriate for my age or mental capacity. The simple pleasure of autonomy, of making choices about my own life without external manipulation or control, still feels like a daily miracle. I've also discovered purposes and pleasures that I never had time for during the chaos of Cassandra's occupation of my home. I volunteer with a legal aid organization that provides assistance to elder abuse victims. Most surprisingly, I found that surviving Cassandra's systematic attempt to destroy my independence has made me stronger and more confident than I was even before Theodore's death. I know now that I can defend myself against virtually any threat, that I have resources and skills that most people underestimate, and that I'm capable of rebuilding my life even after devastating betrayal. Benjamin and Emma come for dinner every Sunday now, a tradition we've maintained for 6 months. We cook together, tend the garden Theodore loved, and talk about ordinary things like Emma's school projects and Benjamin's latest architectural commissions. The conversations are easy now, free from the undercurrents of manipulation and hidden agendas that poisoned our interactions during Cassandra's reign. Last week, Emma asked if she could plant a small section of the garden with vegetables she could tend herself. As I watched her carefully measuring spaces for tomatoes and carrots in the same soil where Theodore and I had once planned our retirement dreams, I realized that some kinds of healing create something even more beautiful than what existed before the damage was done. I am 73 years old now, living alone in the house that Theodore and I built together, surrounded by neighbors who respect my independence, and family members who have learned to value my wisdom. I am financially secure, legally protected, and emotionally free from the fear that dominated those terrible months when I doubted my own perceptions and questioned my own worth. Most importantly, I am no longer naive about the dangers that predators like Cassandra represent to vulnerable people. But I'm also no longer afraid of those dangers, because I know exactly how strong I am when I choose to defend what matters most. The garden will bloom again this spring, and I'll be here to see it. Up next, You've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.